Hello and welcome back. It's Aaron here at the Battle of Prestonpans Museum, bringing you video update number 7 of the What If 2 interactive wargame campaign. This time putting the decisions of the British Army in 1745 into the hands of our Facebook team to see if they can outwit our team of reenactors and wargamers. Now, it's only a few days since the last update, but the 5th of November was an extremely significant event in our campaign. Let's find out what happened. So I left you on a little bit of a teaser after video number 6 because our two armies were finally within striking distance of each other. The British forces under Marshal Wade, a larger army, the Jacobite army with some of its units still tied up in the siege of Stirling to its rear, facing one another across the Bannockburn. It won't have been lost on either side that this was a historic landscape that they're sitting in. Here, amongst the Jacobite soldiers as they're deploying for battle, is the boar stone, the stone in which Robert Bruce raised his standard before the famous victory of 1314. You can see a nice Victorian illustration of some soldiers looking at that important monument, and you can see our interpretation of it on our battlefield there. Stirling Castle is in the distance beyond St Ninians, within sight, wreathed in the smoke of the battery fire, still the Union flag flying. Will that castle hold out? Will the Jacobites accept tying up their forces to besiege it while the battle is raging, or will they feel the pressure and pull their units back and break the siege? Can Marshal Wade break through and fight his way through to the castle, relieving it and turning this location into a historical one for all new reasons? Let's have a close look then at this landscape, because there's a lot going on here. It's a difficult landscape in which to fight. The main feature is the meandering Bannockburn coming through here, heading towards the Forth, although there's a subsidiary stream running through there that will be significant perhaps as well. I've highlighted the main settlement in the area. That's St Ninians, just to the south of Stirling, with its church, which the Jacobites will try not to blow up like they did in 1746 historically. Now, there has been some discussion amongst the Redcoat team as to whether it's possible to try not to fight their way across the Bannockburn, but to launch a flanking engagement either this way or going round towards Cast Mills. So, before we go any further, let's consider those options. Firstly, over to the left of the map, Gillies Hill and the area surrounding it. Well, it's frankly just not a landscape we can move an army in. Gillies Hill, with its wooded top and its steep slopes, is going to be very difficult to move around. To get right past it, still over high ground, means a long diversion and will probably doom the castle anyway. Around the hills, there's also ravines, quarries, streams, farms and enclosures. It's a very difficult landscape. It's unlikely we can consider a flanking move to this side. What about going the other way then, heading this way and crossing at Cast Mill? Well, you can see that if you were to attempt to do that, then you would have to cross the Bannockburn. There is a stone bridge there allowing you to do it, but then you have to cross another stream past a succession of mills and mill lades, a difficult landscape and a very enclosed one. Here it is on our tabletop then, the bridge itself at Cast Mill, the mills, and then the ford beyond, which would allow you access, if you could get across, into the Jacobite rear. The Jacobites know that this is a risk. They have deployed, having had plenty of time to examine this battlefield, and they may well have taken steps to defend this position. So, adding those onto General Roy's map, we've got Cast Mill Bridge, St Ninians in the centre, and then on the left, Gillies Hill and the surrounding high ground and marshland. That leaves us with the main Bannockburn crossings, and it's these on which Marshal Wade is going to have to focus. The first is here at Charters Hall. This is a stone bridge from the end of the 17th century. You can see a photograph inset there of the bridge in real life. It's still standing. And as you can see, indicated on the model, if you cross this bridge, then you then start to climb the heights towards the Bannockburn battlefield, and either side of you is marshland. This is going to be a challenge because it means that to get across this bridge in column, you can't fully deploy into line until you've actually got up onto the heights beyond. So in a gaming system, you're going to need 3 moves in order to get an army from one side of the burn here and into line on the other. Moving into Wade's centre, there's a sort of double crossing point down at the Winds of Milton there. And here they are reflected on the tabletop, one which allows you up towards the high ground this way, and the other past the mill buildings themselves. Perhaps an ill-omened spot for the history of the Stuarts. It was around this spot that James III was killed after his defeat at the Battle of Sockieburn in 1488. And the third crossing in the main area of the battlefield is the one through Bannockburn village itself. Again, this is a stone bridge. And again, you can see a photograph of it there. It still stands. Marshal Wade would have to come through the village of Bannockburn itself, over the bridge, and then get his forces up the sloping ground towards the Jacobites. So our Jacobites have chosen their position well. They are deployed on an area of high ground, anchored on one side by the Balkidderrock woods and on the other by the marshland, the Bannockburn protecting their front. But they are overstretched. They have the smaller army, and they have decided to maintain the siege of Stirling Castle as well. So they have units tied up in Stirling that cannot be used for the battle. So it remains to be seen whether Marshal Wade's boldness and firepower can carry the day against these difficult obstacles. He has to attack. He's honour and duty bound to. He's marched his army all the way here to relieve Stirling Castle. But can he do it without risking the destruction of the only army standing between the Jacobites and the English border? As I said, our Jacobites have had plenty of time to examine this landscape and prepare their positions. Let's start over at Cass Mill, where we can see a detachment of John Roy Stuart's regiment. The other half of the regiment is back in Stirling, has taken up position overlooking the ford here at the mills. They have also prepared this ford with caltrops and defences in the hope of slowing down and damaging any potential attack here. They're particularly worried about an attack here, of course, because if it gets through, then it would be able to sweep up into the rear of the Jacobite army and cut it off from Stirling Castle. Our Jacobites are almost all Highlanders at the engagement. They've formed up in 2 lines across the high grounds, roughly where the Battle of Bannockburn Visitor Centre is these days, where all the roads from those crossings funnel towards St Ninians. The largest regiment on the battlefield is the Clan Cameron, and either side of the Camerons, who are backed up by the Appins, are some very significant batteries of guns. The Jacobites, having stripped Edinburgh Castle after its recent fall, have a substantial advantage in artillery, and both cannons and mortars, both British and French, are deployed on the battlefield for them. The Jacobite right, comprising the 2 battalions of the Athol Brigade, is posted overlooking the bridge at Charters Hall. And it's there at Charters Hall that the battle commences. Marshal Wade decides, not least because some of the team had proposed such an idea, to concentrate as much artillery as possible over on this flank, the British left, in order to open a bombardment in the hope of driving the Athol Brigade off the high ground beyond the bridge and the marshes. That would clear enough space to get the infantry across. Accordingly, Cholmondeley's and Fleming's regiments are formed in column facing towards the bridge, ready for the Athol Brigade to give a little ground so that they can rush across. But remember, these men need to be able to get very successful order rolls in order to get up and deployed. There's a danger that they could get across that bridge and get caught in column by a Highland charge. So it's a risk over here, one that for the time being Marshal Wade isn't willing to take. He's happy at the start of the battle for the artillery to do its work. Most of Wade's British infantry is massed facing the 2 fording points near Milton. I know you love your deployment plans, so thanks to the brilliant Battle Chronicler software again, we're able to look at this simply from above. You can see on the British Army's left that force facing Charters Hall that is threatening this end of the Jacobite line. The main infantry massed around the Winds of Milton. The cavalry is stacked up in Bannockburn because Marshal Wade has spotted and is very tempted by the vulnerability of Fraser's regiment there on its own. Nassau and the Dutch Brigade have been ordered to make that flanking march round to Cask Mill. It's hoped that they will arrive with sufficient strength to be able to push off John Roy Stuart's and then be able to deploy a full division in the Jacobite rear. That's the plan. It's a slightly shaky start for Wade as Nassau's division gets mixed results. Some of the regiments move off with great speed, others start to lag behind. But nevertheless, that flanking move towards Cask Mill is underway. Hoping to exploit that vulnerability in the Jacobite line where they're stretched a little thin with one unsupported regiment, Fraser of Lovat's, facing the cavalry division, Marshal Wade takes the gamble of throwing that cavalry forwards. They get across the bridge, they get deployed, and so it looks like success is on the cards here too. The Royal Regiment gets across the ford and deploys, and Barrels comes up behind them. Whilst to their right, Monroes also get across and deployed, supported by Pulteney's. So the initial moves have succeeded, and it looks like Marshal Wade might get his army over the river. Not only are they across, but they're also doing damage. Firing from the British line is inflicting heavy casualties already on the Clan Cameron in particular, the biggest, most experienced Jacobite unit on the field. So here, just to remind you and let you see it from above, the opening moves of the engagement as Wade commits on the right and in the centre, whilst holding back his left and playing on the Athol Brigade with artillery to try and pin them in place and prevent them from supporting any of the other threatened positions. If the Jacobite infantry and cavalry are a bit overstretched, their artillery have got plenty of firepower to protect their line with, and the Jacobites swing those guns and initially target as much of their firepower as possible on the British cavalry. The delays to the Dutch advance mean that the heavy mortars, which were positioned at Balquhidderug, are able to fire in support of these cohorns that are also now shelling the British advance. And so St George's Regiment of Dragoons leads the spearhead of the British cavalry advance straight towards the Frasers of Lovat. But above the thunder of the hooves, there's now the sound of exploding mortar bombs as that fire comes crashing into the front of the British cavalry division. And in fact, it takes such a devastating toll that the front regiment of Dragoons, St George's, break and flee. It's now up to Gardeners to surge forward and shatter the flank of the Jacobite infantry line. The Frasers bravely countercharge, smashing into Gardiner's Dragoons, and a desperate melee ensues. But the Highlanders have the advantage of the heights, sapping all of the momentum out of the Dragoons' charge. But it still looks desperate. If the cavalry can break through here, then they will be able to sweep into the flank and rear of the Jacobite line. So desperate does the situation look that Charles Edward immediately orders his lifeguard under Lord Elcho to rush across the battlefield on their horses to try and support the Frasers' attack. Meanwhile, this is our situation in the centre. Barrels have been blocked from being able to deploy properly onto the battlefield because of disorder inflicted on the Royal Regiment by the massed Jacobite guns. Further into the centre, Monroes have also been disordered and pinned in position, but Pulteney's have advanced, heading up towards the Clandonald regiments, which they have been able to disorder. The Glengarrys, pinned in place and prevented from charging, taking casualties from Pulteney's fire. And under the withering fire of those British platoon volleys, the Clan Cameron continue to take casualties. They're disordered, they're unable to charge. And then they're routed The biggest Jacobite regiment on the field breaks under fire and flees. The Stuarts of Appin behind them can do nothing more than open up their ranks and let them surge through. This looks like now the Redcoats are about to make a serious impression on the Jacobite line. Let's look at the situation from above then. We can see the Prince's Lifeguards have swept across to try and support Fraser's. The Keppoch regiment has rushed through Glengarry's, who were disordered, and driven Pulteney's back and have fallen upon Monroe's. But the Jacobite line has become split, and if any one of these positions actually falters, then the battle is very much swinging in the balance. Here we see that crucial moment where Keppoch's men have come through to the aid of the Glengarrys, smashing into Pulteney's and driving them back towards Milton. Quite fluid mini-battle then begins around the winds of Milton, both sides having to rotate with their supports and reserves to try and keep the battle going. Eventually, though, Monroe's are pushed back across the ford and Pulteney's are left to try and hold their bridgehead on the far bank. You see the Glengarry men there taking some shelter behind the buildings whilst Keppoch's disordered division is behind, and the Jacobite artillery continues to pound away at Pulteney's. Looking at it from above, just drawing your attention to the top right, we can see that the Dutch have finally got themselves across the bridge and into the ford, where they're into the teeth of the volleys of John Roy Stuart's regiment. And the Stuarts of Appin have begun to move forwards to try and stem the damage done by the rout of the Clan Cameron. Look at the left. Over on the left of the battlefield, large number of units still completely unengaged on both sides. Very ineffective battery fire taking place over here. Let's take a look there. You can see those areas of marshy ground on the far bank of the Bannockburn. The regiments, Cholmondeleys and Flemings, drawn up at the bottom of the screen, ready to cross the bridge. But the artillery fire from this side being very ineffective and failing to dislodge or even inflict any real damage on the two battalions of the Athol Brigade. Then suddenly it seems a blunder. Strathallan's horse, just a small regiment of Highland cavalry, goes surging towards the enemy without orders, without any indication that there's any chance of success. They come storming past the Appin regiment and straight into the teeth of the disciplined fire of the Royal Regiment of Foot. They get through the volley, however, and they crash into the bayonet line. Furious melee ensues, but one in which surely the British infantry line is supported and the rash cavalry charge is not. It's up to the Stuarts of Appin to start coming down off the hill behind them to try and stem any damage that might come if this regiment is broken. And in fact, it is the Royal Regiment that is broken, since surging back, routing across the ford, and as it looks like a very dangerous situation is developing now for the British infantry. At this side, Wade orders Flemings to come away from Charters Hall, deploy into line, and move up to support the threat. To try and make sure that the Athol Brigade is actually pinned in position still, and frustrated at the failure of the artillery, then you can see Cholmondeley's regiment going in as an attack column to get across the bridge and to try and deploy onto the heights against the Athol men. This is not something that Wade wanted to do, but perhaps the only way of trying to create enough of a diversion elsewhere on the battlefield to protect his centre. The arrival of Flemings and the deployment rapidly of Howard's, which was the infantry reserve in the centre, it puts enough support into this action to allow Barrels to drive off Strathallan's horse, routing the Jacobite cavalry and then turning their attention on the Appins beyond. All of a sudden, the situation for the Redcoats seems to have stabilised. Barrels get themselves deployed and their volleys disorder the Stuarts of Appin to ensure that they're not able to charge. It looks like there might be an opportunity yet for the British Army to break through. But there's bad news again over on the right. At Cast Mill, the Dutch infantry have got across the bridge and then into the ford, struggling through the caltrops, taking casualties from the fire of John Roy Stuart's, and then countercharged once they got to the other side. The 1st Battalion of Dutch to try this is broken. The next coming up behind are very reluctant to risk going into that melee. Here's our view from above. Again, then, we can see over on the right, Cholmondeley's making that assault against the Athol Brigade there, outnumbered and unsupported, except by the fire of their artillery. We can see the situation stabilising as the Strathallans are now repelled by the concentration of Flemings, Barrels and Howards. Munros have fallen back at the centre, covered by Pulteney's holding at Milton, but there is bad news at the cavalry engagement. Against astonishing odds, the Frasers of Lovat, supported by Elcho's Life Guards, are holding their position against wave after wave of British cavalry. The mortars in support of them are inflicting terrible damage on units as they're coming up, inflicting enough casualties so that by the time they get into the hand-to-hand, they just can't sustain it. Wade's own regiment of horse are thrown in, hoping to push back Elcho's Life Guards. This should have been where the battle was won, Wade thought, but it isn't going his way. And then defeat potentially turns to disaster as Wade's own regiment is broken and driven back across the bridge at Bannockburn, bodies of horses piling up both around the river and the bridge and on the ground beyond. Over-enthusiastically, though, the Frasers sweep down, driving off what's left of the cavalry in front of them, pushing as far as the burn itself. Elcho's Life Guards swinging round in support to drive back what's left of the British cavalry on that side of the river. But as they do so, they now become the force facing the obstacles. In reserve, behind his cavalry, there's Hamilton's Dragoons and the Georgia Rangers, who now block the village of Bannockburn against the Frasers. And those Dutch regiments that had failed to get up to Cast Mill, they are turned about and brought round to inflict fire onto the rear and flank of Elcho's Life Guards. They drive them back, they stabilise the situation, and the Frasers and the Life Guards are pushed away from the river. Unluckily for Wade's forces, although they drive the Life Guards away from the Bannockburn, that retreat doesn't break them. In fact, it moves them into a position which makes it much easier for them to support John Roy Stuart's at Cast Mill, which means Herzl's regiment, now unsupported, is unlikely to attempt to try and force that crossing where its colleagues had failed. So, although Wade seems to have stabilised his right flank, it seems unlikely that he's going to be able to make any major advances. Meanwhile, Keppochs have finally driven Pulteney's out of the mills at Milton, and they are therefore successful at securing that crossing, but Munros hold their nerve on the far bank and inflict enough casualties on Keppoch's men to deter them from pressing any further. Over on the far left, Cholmondeley's had managed to get up and deployed onto the heights and challenge the Athol Brigade, as I've mentioned, but that engagement was only going to end one way. The Athol Brigade had the supports, Cholmondeley's did not. They are driven back and driven back across the burn. But again, the Jacobites are deterred from pressing any further, now this time because of the artillery, which was protecting the crossing at Charters Hall. In the fords in the centre, though, barrels are able to put a lot of damage in against the Stuarts' Wapping, shaking them, disordering them, preventing them from charging, supported by Flemings and across the river, Howards as well. So there's a stable situation here. There's a temptation to push barrels forwards. Can they finally break the Jacobite centre here? But even if they were able to break the Appins, they would then be staring into 4 batteries of Jacobite guns. Is it worth the risk? At this point, Charles Edward recognises that whilst the Bannockburn had been the biggest challenge for Marshal Wade at the beginning of the battle, it is now Wade's biggest protector in retreat. Charles Edward can't risk sending his Highland units, most of whom have suffered casualties already, some of whom are fairly shaken from the experience so far. He cannot risk throwing them across the burn himself, whilst there are still formed bodies of foot and supporting artillery to oppose them. Instead, the Jacobites consolidate back at their initial line. The Appins are pulled back. The Clandonald regiments are pulled back. Wade takes the chance to disengage barrels as well, pulling them back across the ford and consolidating his line, daring the Jacobites to come on. Both sides are bloodied, both sides are wary now, both sides pretty exhausted. Here then our view of the positions as the two armies consolidate back into the positions where they had first begun. Marshal Wade now calls a council of war. He still has an advantage in terms of infantry, but he's outgunned in artillery and the enemy still holds the high ground. There's still the Bannockburn running between them. If he wasn't able to drive the Jacobites off with his full force, how much less would he be able to do it now with his reduced force? His attempts to force the flank on the far right at Castmill have failed. All of his crossings have been pushed back. But although he's lost the battle, he hasn't lost his army. And so at this point, Marshal Wade decides the most important thing he can do is consolidate, is to rally, and to hold those crossings. He cannot force his way through to relieve Stirling Castle, but he can still at least stop the Jacobites coming onto this side of the Bannockburn. Charles Edward gathers his officers too around the Boar Stone, so famous in the stories of Scottish history. He's won an impressive victory, but not without losses. He's lost half of his very precious cavalry force, for example, and the biggest and proudest of his regiments, the Clan Cameron, had been broken. He can't pursue the enemy, but he doesn't need to. He can now focus on ensuring the surrender of Stirling Castle comes soon in the wake of his second victory. So goodness, where does this leave us strategically? Well, the blue blobs are, of course, the Jacobite forces, the biggest one, right in the heart of Scotland, victorious once again in battle now. Charles Edward's field army, likely to soon suppress that small red dot in the centre, which is the Stirling Castle garrison. The other blue spot up in the Western Highlands is a new Jacobite regiment which has just been raised, which is no doubt going to look at potentially intervening against the red spots. Now, those are the three Highland forts in the north: Fort George, Fort Augustus, Fort William, and Argyll's regiment of Highland militia. Back down in the centre of Scotland, we have Marshal Wade's forces, what remains of it. And it remains to be seen how many of the men broken at the battle today will be able to rally and return to the colours. The small one to the southwest of Wade's position is a new militia which has been raised at Paisley. That's all that's left in Scotland. Small garrisons remain at Berwick, Carlisle and Newcastle. But the only field force of regular troops south of Wade is the division that has arrived under Sir John Ligonier down in the south, withdrawn from Europe. The government in London is starting to become extremely concerned. Militia have been ordered to be raised for the defence of England. The Duke of Cumberland has returned from the continent and more regiments are going to follow in his wake. But Wade has not been destroyed. And that means there is still a chance that the war can be contained in the north of Scotland. What happens next? Well, that depends on our teams. Congratulations to Brett, Alex and Dave for their success in coordinating a very successful Jacobite strategy and a tactical win. Now, our Facebook group, you can see the directions to it there. What if 1745 Wargame? That's where our British Army team will decide how to respond to this latest setback. Thanks for watching. I hope you're enjoying, and I'll see you again soon.